You're listening to episode 134 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Andy Puddicombe speaks with us about his site and new book, Get Some Headspace, How Mindfulness Can Change Your Life in 10 Minutes a Day. In what ways is Buddhist practice finding new forms in our contemporary society? What would a secular program of meditation look like? Not just mindfulness, but also loving-kindness, for example, so that not just Buddhists benefit. And once we're no longer geographically constrained because of the opportunities of digital media, what can we expect to see? Setting off to become a monk at the age of 22, Andy Puddicombe's meditation training took him all over the world, culminating with full ordination at a Tibetan monastery in the Himalayas. 10 years later, Andy returned to the UK with a singular wish to demystify meditation, to make it accessible, relevant, and beneficial to as many people as possible. When Andy finished his time as a monk, he did what all ex-monks do. He went back to university and did a degree in circus arts. These days, he's more interested in surfing and snowboarding than acrobatics, and working on Headspace, a website designed to support a secular meditation practice. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Puddicombe extra fancy. And our guest today is Andy Puddicombe. Andy, thank you for being here.
Pleasure, Ted. Thanks for having me on.
I'm very glad to, the timing of this was very good because I found an article about Headspace and thought it would be interesting, and I reached out and we set up this interview. And then about a week later on the Facebook page for the Secular Buddhist, someone said, "Hey, does anyone know anything about this Headspace thing?" And I was able to say, conveniently, I will be speaking with Andy in another week or two. So again, thank you for doing this. What I'd like to ask first is for you to tell us about your background, because you have a bit more of a past in Buddhism than many of us may have. So tell us about that, where it all began for you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Ted. I was really very fortunate. I got a really early introduction to both meditation and Buddhism. Although I grew up in a Christian family, my mum had a real interest in both. So I started going along to classes when I was about sort of 10 or 11 years old. And I guess spent a couple of years sort of really, having a go. I didn't always find it very easy. I was a very active sort of child, so the idea of sitting down for long periods of time was quite challenging. And then I think sort of as a teenager, I sort of got involved in other stuff. There were other interests, as I'm sure you'll understand.
That happens to us when we become teenagers, yeah.
Exactly. And it wasn't really until, I guess I was in my early 20s, I was at university doing a degree in sports science. And a couple of things had happened in my late teens that I'd really struggled with and I hadn't really come to terms with in my own mind and didn't know how to deal with them. And I'd spoken to the doctor and, he'd recommended kind of Prozac, and I'd talked to friends and they'd sort of suggested other things. And just that idea of sort of training the mind and examining my own mind just sort of just kept coming back, and it was in the end it was actually a very easy decision to go away and to become a monk and to begin that training into, I guess, meditation as a vocation, if you like.
So you ended up from there, after deciding you were going to take
Yeah.
this journey, you selected a Tibetan practice. What drew you to that instead of any other of the traditions that you might have had some experience with?
Well, do you know, I'd love to say that I spent a long time sort of, studying each of the traditions and, but the truth is, I had a friend that had just come back from Dharamsala. They'd been there to see the Dalai Lama, and they said, you just got to check it out. And I was actually planning to fly straight to Thailand, and I thought, okay, well, I'll go to Dharamsala first. So I went there, and I went into a short retreat just for a couple of weeks into an FPMT retreat there, and I found it fascinating. But I was kind of overwhelmed by the richness of the Tibetan tradition. There was so much of culturally, artistically, and sort of the techniques as well were so different from ones that I'd done before that I was actually kind of a little overwhelmed by it all. So although I went first for that, I actually quite quickly then ended up going back towards a more traditional Theravadan approach. I was again very fortunate. I found a teacher who trained in the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition in Burma and was able to get me a visa to go there. So I spent some time training there, and also with the teacher over in Australia. Eventually coming back and training with in a Theravadan monastery here in the UK. And so I guess over a period of about 5 years, either training as a layperson or as a novice monk within that tradition. And then I was introduced to a teacher in the Karma Kagyu tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, and he had a very different take on the Tibetan tradition as a whole. Actually, he'd spent about 12 years in cloistered retreat up in Scotland at the Samye Monastery, and he had a real kind of knack of cutting through everything and just sort of getting to the essence of the practice. And he spoke in a way which I understood. He was a Westerner, but who, probably had about 25 years training in that school. And I just really kind of warmed to him and felt that actually that was a very natural path to move in that direction.
Yeah, and the interesting things that come out of this is that for many of us, we may not have the opportunities to investigate a number of traditions. We may just go with the first one we stick to, and
Yeah,
that human engagement appeal and what can be overwhelming or very, very compelling to us in traditions. There's nothing wrong with that. We can learn from that, and it's a rich, rich experience.
yeah,
And it's also very important for us to have, as you're just describing now with this teacher, that
mm,
kind of understanding that you really, really get what they're saying, that that's what speaks to you most. And we have such great variety in our lives. Of course, one teacher may not speak to you that does to another, and that's okay. There's
yeah,
nothing wrong with that. We're individuals.
yeah. Very much so. And I really respect the traditions that I trained in to begin with. They provided a really strong foundation. And I recognize that for many other individuals and personalities, that would have been the perfect approach, probably for their entire life. I think the way in which I sort of interacted with them actually was not necessarily that skillful, and was based on a lot of effort, and if I'm really kind of honest, sort of quite self-interested effort as well. And it was really coming into contact with those teachings where there was a greater emphasis on compassion, on selflessness, and on others, that it provided a warmth that I'd never really experienced in my practice before. And it really started to sort of shift things and change things. And that was a key moment in my training, I would say.
Yeah. So where did it go from there? You started having these shifts in a
Yeah.
positive direction for you. What happened next?
So this particular teacher happened to be out in teaching in Moscow in Russia. So I packed my bags once again and went and went off to Moscow and pretty soon realized that okay, I'd found someone who I was really comfortable with, and we went out to India together, and I met His Holiness the Karmapa soon after he'd escaped from Tibet, and I had a chat about whether to ordain, to take full ordination, whether to go into retreat. And so I took ordination with Situ Rinpoche at Palpung Institute at Sherabling Monastery, and then I went into a 1 year retreat at Samyeling in Scotland. Before then going back to teach in the same meditation center in Moscow that I started out at in Little. So I probably stayed there for about another 2, 3 years. And in many ways, Ted, that was the beginning of starting to see the potential for meditation in a secular environment or a secular approach. Working in the meditation center there or teaching there, I started to see lots of people who clearly got a huge amount from the meditation, but who really sort of struggled with the whole sort of bald-headed guy in a skirt thing. Which I really could understand. Even though I was the bald-headed guy in a skirt, I could kind of see where they were coming from, because that was something that I had struggled with, and and I thought, okay, so it's the essence of the teachings, and it's the experience of actually sitting and practicing, which where people sort of see the benefits of the practice. So, it started me off thinking, is there a way of delivering this without diluting the teachings and the essence of those teachings?
Yeah, and that is that key point that we hear in any kind of secular approach, is that a traditional response typically is, this is a watering down, it's going to ruin the teaching, and
Yeah.
and this is not Buddhism. And many of us reply that, well, there are still benefits to this without necessarily having those trappings, and we are concerned about that. We certainly don't want to ruin what we have found to be of benefit. So how did you deal with that, trying to have that distinguishing between what's perhaps a cultural trapping or not contributive to your practice and
Yeah.
what is? How did you do that? Because that's got to be tough wrestling.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it often surprises a lot of people when I tell them, sort of, especially as they look at sort of the Headspace project as it exists now. I was quite hard line, I was quite traditional in my approach to monasticism and Buddhism, and I was not at all keen to sort of move any of those things on at all or adapt them to begin with. So I tried quite hard to sort of maintain that exact same approach, and I started working with a couple of doctors here in the UK, and they were referring patients who had difficulty with insomnia and high blood pressure and a number of different sort of stress related ailments. And it was just from experience. It was from sitting down and talking to people, and really trial and error, finding out what kind of language people were comfortable with, and when they sat down, leading them through meditations, sort of working out kind of again what were people benefiting from. So I guess in a very traditional sense, actually. So I always liked the idea that Buddha taught that, don't listen to kind of what I have to say necessarily. Don't believe exactly what I say. Try this, see if it works. If it works and there's something in it for you as an individual, then great. Learn some more. Try something else. Try the next thing. And that's really always been my approach. And I've always said to people, don't just believe this because I'm saying this, because I was once a monk in another country. That's not really relevant. you know Try this, see if it works. And I've worked closely with my teachers as well in sort of adapting this and making it more relevant, but hopefully nonetheless beneficial.
Yeah, it's ehi passiko, come and see, not come and believe. Check it
Yeah.
out for yourself. This is a path that you need to take on your own. It's not something we should accept due to argument from authority.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So you're at this point you're monastic. You see these secular applications, and the people are benefiting from it without necessarily having to take on vows of monasticism.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did that then grow? What happened next?
Yeah. Do you know, I think the final push, or the tipping point, if you like, is it was the vice president of the oil company BP, who was coming along to, I'm sure he won't mind me saying, coming along to the meditation center in Moscow, and he said, you know, Andy, he said, I was Norbu at the time, as I was. He said, you know, Norbu, he said, I'd love you to come in to the company and to work with some of the management stuff. He said they would so much benefit from this, and he said, but you know, like I can't walk in there with a Buddhist monk, you know, like, and I get that. I think to walk into an oil company anywhere in the world dressed as a Buddhist monk would be challenging, but in Moscow, that's a whole nother level. So it got me thinking, you know, and I was just coming to the end of a particular commitment of time that I'd made with Sister Rinpoche. And so it was actually, you know, it had come to a time where I was either going to make another commitment of time as a monk, or I was going to stop. And I decided, or you know, I thought, okay, what am I most passionate about? Am I passionate about being a monastic for the rest of my life, or am I passionate about sharing the teachings of meditation that I've received and benefited from? That made it a very easy choice, actually, a very easy decision. So yeah, I simply stopped my time as a monk, as I previously discussed with Siddha Rinpoche, and returned to being a layperson, but continuing to teach in that meditation center in Moscow for a little while longer.
Did you find that was a bit of a difficult transition? Did you run into some challenges as you went from the rules of monasticism to a lay life?
Yeah, yeah. I think there's always challenges. I found challenges in both directions, Ted. To be honest, sort of moving to become a monastic and also moving back to being a lay person. I think being a monastic, certainly there's a framework in place where everything sort of is set up in a very conducive way for the practice. And as soon as you sort of step out of that, then you know that framework becomes a bit more flexible. Um, I think probably because I trained for a reasonable period of time, the framework felt fairly sort of solid nonetheless. You know, so it wasn't that there was a sudden change of lifestyle or anything like that. And you know, because I was continuing to teach in the center, it actually felt, I think I was quite lucky, quite a sort of natural transition. It was quite a new thing, obviously, to be able to go out perhaps and have a girlfriend and that kind of thing. That there were some benefits, you know. There was a number of kind of changes. I think that the biggest thing, and this often sort of surprises people, but one of the biggest changes was before I'd become a monk, I was really active. You know, I competed in gymnastics, and I really did a sort of a lot of physical exercise. So for 10 years, I really did nothing, you know, apart from prostrations in Tibetan monasteries. I really did no physical exercise. So when I finished my time as a monk, one of the things I was most sort of keen to explore was that sort of sense of physicality again. And I was very lucky in Moscow. I met a guy who was training at Moscow State Circus, and he suggested that I go along with him. And I started taking private lessons in acrobatics and juggling. And they said, look, you know, you can actually do a degree in this. You could, in London, you can do a degree in circus. And it got me thinking, you know, and I thought, okay, well, I want to set up this project, but I have no money, I have no belongings. What am I going to do when I go back to
Yeah.
London? You know, how am I going to make this work? And I don't know how it works in the US, but in the UK, it's quite easy to get funding to be a student. You have to borrow money, but it's a good way of borrowing money. So yeah, I put an audition tape together in Moscow. I sent it to London, and somehow managed to get myself a place at university. And I came back and I did while I was setting up the project, I did a degree in circus arts.
Excellent. That's wonderful. Now, I imagine with that transition to now, as you said, being more aware of the physicality and some of the benefits of personal relationships and things like that,
Yeah.
that coming to it with this idea that you've been then training in for several years of not being too attached to them. Was that a different experience for you from having those kinds of relationships and activities from before you had that training? But because you had started the practice very young, so was that always a part of your life?
Um, Although I'd started it young, I'm a very slow learner, Ted. So I'm not sure how many of those things had really sunk in at an earlier age, or even now. You know, um, I think there was a really marked difference, if particularly in the relationships um, that, that I shared in my life. I really that's where I noticed the biggest difference actually was just being in a very comfortable place with those relationships, even some of them that weren't particularly kind of easy. I know in the past that I would have reacted I'm quite sure I would have reacted in a very different way, probably not such a helpful way. So I certainly haven't always got it right since then, but I have noticed a really big difference.
Mhm. Well, that's what the practice is about. It's not a perfect, it's a practice.
Absolutely.
It's an ongoing development. So you've, of course, I have this vision in my head of you graduating with that degree, walking up and getting your diploma in a clown suit and rubber nose. So you've got this experience, this training, and
Yeah.
you've got a little bit of money. What's the next step? What happens then?
So the next step, I'd really worked on a lot of the content while I was at the circus. So in terms of the content, I mean the content of what would a secular program of meditation look like, and what would it include? So looking at ways of adapting, not just sort of mindfulness practices, which of course are what get talked about most of all within the secular world now, but also sort of loving kindness and the four reflections and practices like Tonglen, and how is it possible to speak about those in a way which people will feel comfortable with and that people will still experience benefit from. So a huge amount of time went into, I guess, yeah, just adapting those in such a way that my baseline always was, could I go down and talk about this to one of my mates in the pub
Right.
without them kind of having a laugh at my expense?
Yeah, edging away slowly and saying, "Oh my, look at the time."
Exactly, exactly. And so when I got to the point each time, I would then go back over and think, okay, so I've got it to the point where I can talk about, but what has anything been lost along the way? Are the key ingredients still there? And so that was just a process, I'd say, of probably 2 or 3 years then of working with people, and mostly one to one, sometimes smaller groups as well, and just seeing, okay, making sure that it worked. Um, and then I met the co-founder of Headspace, a guy called Rich Pearson. And I think that it would be fair to say, that that's when Headspace stepped up a gear. It changed direction. It became more scalable, effectively, Ted. So when Rich came along to the clinic to meet me, he was like, "This is amazing. Like, I'd never heard of meditation before. I never would have considered doing it." But he said, "You're sat here in a clinic seeing one person at a time. He said, there are millions of people out there who could benefit from this. How do we take this simple teaching that you've learned and make it available for those people?" And that was something I had obviously no. We didn't do a lot of online digital stuff in the monastery, as you can imagine.
Yeah,
But,
not so much.
yeah, that was really kind of a new time of learning for me.
So there's this now gem of an idea of, hey, wait a minute, if we have something online and we use digital media, we're no longer geographically constrained.
exactly that. And but interestingly, that then that brought up all the same questions that had come up earlier of, okay, what gets lost when you take away that human interaction, that that sort of personable interaction of the teachings? Does something else get lost? So I have to say I was extremely resistant for a good year or so about actually letting go of that, the necessity of being with somebody actually doing the teaching or receiving the teaching. But again, it was trial and error. We tested it. People came back and said, not everybody, but a lot of people came back and said, I love this. This really works. And the more we adapted and tinkered with it, the more positive the response. And before long, we kind of felt really confident. We were ready to launch the project and a service or a product that could really be a benefit to others.
And looking at the website now, and for folks who are listening to the podcast, and I'll repeat this again at the end, the address is www.getsomeheadspace.com. Andy, tell us about some of the things that are there and what really the goal is with this and some of the offerings you have on the site.
Sure. So I think at the heart of the whole Headspace project is something called the Headspace journey. So what we're interested in as a project is not just to get people to try meditation, because it's kind of easy to get people to try something.
Yeah.
It's about getting people to stay with a daily practice on an ongoing basis, because that's where people are going to see the benefit. So I created a year-long journey. It's 365 days. Every single day is a different meditation. So essentially, Rich and the team locked me in a recording studio for a few months. And so it's about 280 hours of material there. So it's looking at many of those different areas of mindfulness, of visualization, of reflective type, contemplative practices, loving kindness at Tonglen, moving towards a place where people no longer feel dependent on a guided meditation and where they feel confident to engage on a daily basis, sort of in a practice that they feel most comfortable with, that they feel is most useful for them. So that's really the heart of the practice. I think on the website there are lots of sort of other add-ons. There's a whole section on integration, so podcasts on how to integrate a more mindful approach to whether it's to work or to sports or to eating or to including some of the more traditional practices like sort of walking and standing meditations. And I guess to a large extent as well, we try to display on the site interesting projects that we're involved in that will help for people who've never done any meditation before, help give them permission to sit down. And that, it sounds strange at first, but for example, once people found out that we had a Headspace channel on Virgin Atlantic, they were like, really? And because they have confidence and trust in Virgin as a brand, it's something they're familiar with, then they're like, oh, okay. Oh, well, maybe it is okay. I'll try it and see. So whenever we do kind of larger projects with, different brands, then we'll always try and promote those on the website. And that's so people feel, more confident about trying something that they might have previously been a bit shy about trying, and certainly not something that they wanted to share with their friends. So there's definitely kind of a re-education component around the project, sort of helping people to redefine meditation through their experience rather than through what other people, media especially, have told them, or sort of previous misconceptions, preconceptions they might have.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I am particularly like as a science geek is you have an entire science section. And as I look at that, I see you have references to studies by Sarah Lazar, Tim Gard, Britta Holzel, Philippe Goldin. These are all people who have been on the podcast and speaking about these references, these studies that you have here. So this is very much in alignment with what we're doing here with a secular approach. And that's nice to see, because it's not just well, here's this thing, and we have no backing behind it. We're doing it without any kind of critical thought or investigation. No, you do, and you provide what those references are, which is really nice to see. So thank you for putting that, specifically that kind of reference out there.
It's a pleasure, and I have to say a very big thank you as well to Dr. Judson Brewer, who's the director of the Therapeutic Neuroscience Clinic at Yale, who's been working with Headspace now for the past year or so. We've teamed up in partnership to launch what we hope will be the largest sort of piece of research into meditation and mindfulness that there's been, and he has been just a huge help in sort of really clarifying some of that research and helping us sort of present that in a way that's really kind of bite-sized and accessible.
Yeah. And I see that there's also a blog and a community section. Tell us about those.
So the blog, some of the, I guess more of the community stuff actually tends to go on our Facebook page, but there's a blog section where either I'll do something myself on a relevant topic for something that's going on in the world perhaps at the time, or we run little kind of I guess little themes. I think last week there was the theme of giving, looking at different aspects of giving. There was a project a few weeks ago where we were looking at the idea of staycations, for example. So rather than actually kind of feeling like we always need to go somewhere else, that actually every not just internally but externally, kind of that everything we need is already here if we can just kind of bring a little bit of kind of curiosity and interest and a sense of presence to our everyday life. So that's really the focus. It's giving people the tools to engage with this stuff in a way beyond what can sometimes feel like a very isolated practice. Because obviously, once you take away the idea of a sangha that sits together to meditate, there's the potential for it to feel quite sort of lonely and isolated. Lots of people off in different places doing the meditation. So the long-term goal of the community is to provide an online sangha where people can reflect with one another, communicate with one another, and in time sit with one another as well. So we're just moving into the next phase of the project where that will become a much bigger feature.
Andy, there's also a recent release of a new book that has come out. Tell us about that.
Yes, so there are actually there are two Headspace books out now. The first one was Get Some Headspace, which came out in the UK last year. It's just launched in the US, and that's really it's an introduction to meditation and mindfulness for people who've perhaps always thought that they might like to give it a go, but never were too sure exactly what it is or how to go about it. I've met so many people who said they love the idea of it, but they're either too busy to meditate, or they're too stressed to meditate, or it's a little bit too kind of woo-woo for them.
It's like saying I'm too hungry to eat.
Exactly. The irony. But I felt there was perhaps a gap out there for just a really down-to-earth conversational way of presenting meditation, and essentially sharing many of my, I guess, experiences of making mistakes in meditation. Because that was when I think back, I made pretty much every mistake that there is to make, and I kind of think, well, there's some value in that for other people, because if they hear about those mistakes, then they maybe can, not make the same mistake. So I've included in it lots of experiences, not only from my times in the monastery. Some very funny, amusing stories from the monastery, but also since then, from the circus and just everyday life. It's a very very grounded book.
Yeah. And there's a second one as well?
There is, yeah. So I'm still not, I have to say, so keen on the title of this one. It's called that. And I say that even though it's my own book. Obviously there are discussions with the publishers, but it's essentially it's called the Headspace Diet. And these days, of course, diet has a certain connotation, and most people immediately assume it's like a faddish type diet, but it's actually diet in the more traditional sense of the term, in terms of a sustainable way of eating for the rest of our lives. And really it's taking the topic of mindful eating and applying that as a lens to the way in which we consume, not only individually, but as a society, and the implications of that on our self-esteem as individuals, on the way in which we live as a community, as a society, and the way in which we could, if we ate in a more mindful way, reduce the amount of suffering both in the human and the sort of animal realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and interestingly enough, I've heard the term mindful eating before. That's come up in several different interviews. So there are a number of people who have a very similar interest in raising the awareness that the way we consume, and not just physically, but the way we consume media and knowledge and all of this, is done in a not very aware fashion of what is the best way to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Excellent, excellent. Well, folks who are listening to the podcast, our guest today has been Andy Puddicombe, and the website, again, for folks who are listening, is www.getsomeheadspace.com. Andy, I've really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, Ted. Thanks again for having me on.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.